The heavy oak door of the Hawthorne estate didn't just close. It sealed, like the lid of a casket shutting out the light. I stood on the porch, the biting wind of November 1932 cutting through my thin wool coat, clutching Rose's hand so tight her knuckles turned white against the gray evening. Inside that house, there was warmth, the smell of roasting meats, and the ticking of a grandfather clock that had measured out the misery of my marriage. But out here, there was only the depression and the terrifying silence of a world that had stopped working. My mother-in-law, a woman whose pearls cost more than my father had made in his lifetime, had been polite when she did it, which somehow made it worse. She had handed me an envelope with $50 and told me that without her son, my husband, who had been buried only 3 weeks, there was simply no familial obligation to maintain our residence. She looked at Rose, her own granddaughter, with the detached pity one might offer a stray cat before closing the window. "You're young, Clara," she had said, her voice smooth as glass. "You'll find work. But this house is for family, and technically, the legal definition has shifted." I looked down at Rose. She was 10 years old, wrapped in a coat that was already too short in the sleeves, her eyes wide and dry. She didn't cry. She had learned early that crying in front of the Hawthorns was a sign of weakness they would only exploit, so she held it in, shivering not from the cold but from the sudden, yawning lack of gravity. We walked down the long, gravel driveway, the stones crunching like bones under our boots. I had one suitcase, $50, and a child to keep alive in a winter that the radio weathermen were already calling the worst in a decade. We walked until the manicured lawns of the wealthy district gave way to the cracked pavement of the city center, where men in flat caps stood in breadlines wrapped around the block, their breath puffing in the freezing air like tired ghosts. We found a boarding house that smelled of boiled cabbage and damp plaster, renting a room for $1 a night, watching our lifeline drain away. It was on the 3rd night, huddled under a single scratchy blanket, that I saw the ad in a discarded newspaper used to stuff the drafty window frame. It was buried in the back, a tiny rectangle of text that looked like a mistake. Surplus Quonset hut, military grade, as is, $500. Land included. Dead man's flats. It was absurd. A lie surely, but when you are drowning you don't check the quality of the driftwood. You just grab it. The clerk at the municipal office looked at me as if I had asked to buy a ticket to the moon. He was a thin man with ink stains on his cuffs and the weary expression of someone who had processed too many foreclosures that year. He adjusted his wire-rimmed spectacles and tapped the deed with a yellowed fingernail. "You understand, Mrs. Vance, that as is a legal term carrying significant weight," he said, his voice dry. "This isn't a cottage. It's a corrugated steel shell left over from a cancelled railway project during the war. It sits on a patch of scrubland 10 miles past the paved road. There's no water main, no electricity. The soil is hard-packed clay and rock." I placed the $5 bill on the counter. It was a significant portion of what we had left, a terrifying gamble, but I had done the math in my head all night. Rent would bleed us dry in 2 weeks. Ownership, no matter how rusted or remote, was a fortress. "Does it have a roof?" I asked, my voice steady despite the trembling in my hands. The clerk sighed, stamping the paper with a heavy thud that echoed in the empty room. "Technically," he muttered, "though I wouldn't trust it against a heavy drift." I signed my name, Clara Vance, with a pen that scratched against the paper, feeling the weight of the decision settle in my chest. Rose was sitting on a bench near the radiator, watching me. She didn't ask where we were going or what I was doing. She trusted me with a blind faith that terrified me more than the poverty. We used a portion of our remaining funds to hire a man with a flatbed truck to take us out there. The drive was long and silent, the city receding into a gray smudge behind us as the landscape opened up into the bleak, white expanse of the country. The snow was deeper here, banking against the fence posts. The driver, a taciturn man named Mr. Gantry, chewed on a toothpick and glanced at us in the rearview mirror every few miles. His eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and pity. When he finally pulled off the road onto a rutted, frozen track, the truck bounced violently, throwing us against each other. "End of the line, ma'am," he said, braking hard. I looked out the window. There, Rising out of the snow like the spine of a buried leviathan was the Quonset hut. It was a semi-cylinder of corrugated steel, rusted to the color of dried blood, sitting alone in a field of white. It looked abandoned, hostile, and utterly uninhabitable. But it was ours. Mr. Gantry helped us unload our few boxes of supplies: canned beans, blankets, a kerosene lantern, and a small bag of coal I had fought for at the depot. He lingered for a moment before getting back in his cab, looking at the rusting hulk and then at Rose. "Forecast says storm coming tonight," he said, tipping his cap. "If the cold gets too bad, burn the furniture if there is any. Don't be a hero." Then he drove off, the taillights fading into the gloom, leaving us in a silence so profound it felt heavy. I took Rose's hand and walked toward the structure. The large sliding doors at the front were jammed with ice and rust. I had to use a pry bar I'd bought at the hardware store, throwing my entire body weight against the iron. It shrieked, a metal scream that tore through the quiet, and inched open just enough for us to slip inside. The interior was cavernous and freezing, darker than the outside. The wind hammered against the corrugated ribs, making the whole building hum like a tuning fork. The floor was dirt hard as concrete. It smelled of ancient grease, ozone, and decay. "Is this home now, Mama?" Rose asked, her voice small, echoing off the curved metal ceiling. I lit the lantern, the yellow glow pushing back the shadows, revealing cobwebs thick as ropes and piles of industrial refuse covered in tarps. "Yes, Rose," I said, forcing a smile I didn't feel. "It's a fortress. The bad wolves can't blow this house down." We survived the first night by huddled warmth and sheer willpower. We cleared a circle in the center of the dirt floor, stacking old crates to break the wind that whistled through the seams in the metal. I kept the lantern low to save oil, and we slept in shifts, wrapped in every blanket we owned. When morning broke, the light filtering through the grime-encrusted skylights was gray and weak, but it revealed the true scale of what we had bought. The hut was massive, far larger than it looked from the outside. It wasn't just an empty shell. It was a graveyard of machinery. Along the curved walls, beneath layers of dust, were workbenches bolted into the ground. I began to explore while Rose tried to sweep the dirt floor with a branch she'd found outside. I pulled a heavy canvas tarp off a shape in the corner, expecting a pile of rusted junk. Instead, I found a massive, cast-iron potbelly stove, disconnected but intact. It was a beaut, with chrome handles and a belly big enough to burn logs. Beside it was a stack of stovepipes. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was heat. This was life. I spent the next 3 hours wrestling the heavy iron pipes into place, my hands black with soot and numb from the cold. I had to stand on a rotting crate to feed the pipe through the vent hole in the ceiling, praying the seal would hold. When I finally lit the first fire using the coal and some broken crate wood, the stove groaned as the metal expanded. Slowly, miraculously, a radius of warmth began to push back the freezing air. Rose sat in front of it, holding her hands out, the orange glow lighting up her face. But the real discovery happened when I tripped over a metal ridge in the floor near the back of the hut. I scraped away the dirt and realized it wasn't just a ridge. It was a handle, recessed into a steel plate. A trapdoor. I called Rose over and together we pulled. It was heavy, counterweighted by some hidden mechanism. It swung up with a hiss of pneumatic pressure that shouldn't have been working after all these years. Below was not a damp root cellar, but a concrete steps leading down into darkness. The air that drifted up didn't smell like rot. It smelled like oil refined and clean. It smelled like a workshop that had been put to sleep, not abandoned. I took the lantern and descended the stairs, telling Rose to stay at the top. The sublevel was dry, insulated from the freezing ground. The beam of my light swept across the space, revealing rows of metal shelving stocked with precision. There were boxes of high-grade rivets, sealed canisters of engine oil, and tools, beautiful, heavy tools made of vanadium steel, greased and wrapped in oilcloth to prevent rust. This hadn't been a storage shed for a railway. It had been a mechanic's sanctuary. In the corner, covered by a sheet, sat a generator, and beside it, A 50-gallon drum marked kerosene. I fell to my knees, tears finally spilling over. We had fuel. We had tools. We had materials. The $50 the Hawthorns had given me was an insult, a payoff to disappear and die quietly. But for $5 we had bought a future. I climbed back up the stairs, my face smeared with grease but my eyes bright. "Rose," I said, grabbing a pair of heavy shears from the workbench. "We aren't just camping anymore. We're going to build." Over the next week, the hut changed. The stove became the heart of the home, its heat turning the steel shell into a giant radiator that trapped warmth surprisingly well once we plugged the drafts with mud and scrap canvas. We scrubbed the skylights until the winter sun poured in, illuminating the dust motes like gold dust. I used the tools from the basement, wrenches, saws, hammers that felt balanced and purposeful in my hand, to reinforce the doors and build proper beds raised off the floor. I found that I had a knack for it. My father had been a watchmaker, and though I had never held a welding torch, the logic of how things fit together, how tension and support worked, felt native to my blood. Rose, too, came alive. She wasn't just the fragile girl in the coat anymore. She was a scavenger, finding bolts and washers in the dirt, organizing the inventory in the basement, creating a catalog of our sudden wealth. We were isolated, miles from the nearest town, but we weren't helpless. We were becoming the masters of our iron cave. Then came the day the black sedan rolled up the track. I heard the engine before I saw it, a smooth, purring sound that was alien to the rough silence of the flats. I wiped my hands on a rag and stepped out the sliding door, my breath pluming in the cold air. A man stepped out of the car. He was dressed in a camel hair coat and polished shoes that looked ridiculous in the snow. He adjusted his hat and looked at the Quonset hut with a mixture of distaste and calculation. "Mrs. Vance?" he called out, his voice carrying that same polished arrogance I remembered from the Hawthorne estate. "My name is Mr. Sterling. I represent a consortium of local investors." He didn't wait for an invite. He walked closer, his eyes scanning the structure, lingering on the repaired roof and the smoke curling cheerfully from the chimney. "We've been reviewing some old municipal records," he said, stopping 10 feet away. "It seems there was a clerical error regarding this plot, a zoning oversight. We'd like to correct it." He pulled a crisp check from his pocket. "I'm authorized to offer you $50 to vacate. That's 10 times your investment. A handsome profit for a week of camping." I looked at the check, then at the hut behind me. I thought of the basement full of tools, the heat of the stove, and the safety we had built with our own hands. But mostly, I looked at his eyes. He wasn't looking at me, he was looking at the ground, at the specific angle of the land. He wasn't here for the hut. He was here for something else, and he was lying. $50, I repeated, my voice flat. "That's a lot of money." Mr. Sterling. Rose stepped up beside me, holding a heavy wrench she had been polishing. She looked small but fierce, a little gargoyle of the scrap yard. "It is," Sterling smiled, thin and sharp, "enough to get you back to the city. To a proper room." I folded my arms, feeling the cold steel of a caliper I'd slipped into my pocket earlier. "I think you're mistaken about the value, sir," I said. "And I think you're mistaken about us. This isn't a campsite. It's a residence. And it's not for sale." Sterling's smile didn't waver, but his eyes went cold. "Everybody sells eventually, Mrs. Vance. It's just a matter of how difficult the winter gets." He got back in his car and drove away, leaving a cloud of exhaust that hung in the air like a threat. I watched him go, knowing that the real storm hadn't even started yet. The blizzard that Mr. Gantry had predicted arrived 3 days later, and it was not merely a weather event. It was a siege. The wind didn't howl so much as it shrieked, a high-pitched vibration that rattled the corrugated steel teeth of our home until my own molars ached. The temperature plummeted, turning the moisture on the inside of the windows into fern-like patterns of ice that thickened by the hour. Even with the potbelly stove glowing a dangerous cherry red, the heat was being sucked out through the uninsulated floor faster than we could generate it. Rose was bundled in 3 layers of wool, sitting so close to the iron belly of the stove that I worried her coat would singe, but she wouldn't move. "The cold has fingers, Mama," she whispered, looking at the door where the frost was creeping across the floorboards like a living fungus. We were burning through our coal reserve too fast. I calculated the pile in the corner against the days of gray darkness, and the math didn't work. We needed more energy, or the Quonset would become exactly what it looked like, a metal tomb. I took the lantern and went down into the basement, the air cooler there but still smelling of oil and dry concrete. My eyes went to the generator in the corner. It was a monstrosity of cast iron and copper wiring, a sleeping beast from a different era. I had avoided it because the complexity intimidated me. My father's watches were delicate, logical things, but this was a brute force engine. Yet, desperation clarifies the mind. I pulled the canvas cover off, revealing the instruction plate riveted to the side. Fairbanks Morse Type Z, 6 horsepower. I spent the next 2 hours tracing the fuel lines, checking the spark plug gap with a feeler gauge I found in a toolbox, and priming the carburetor. My hands were slick with kerosene and trembling, not just from the cold but from the fear that I might break the only lifeline we had. Rose stood at the top of the stairs, watching the darkness of the basement, a silent sentinel. "Stand back, Rose," I called out, gripping the heavy flywheel. I threw my weight against it. The engine coughed a dry, hacking sound and died. I tried again and again. My shoulders burned, and sweat broke out under my layers of clothes. On the 10th try, the beast roared. It was a rhythmic, thumping heartbeat that shook the floorboards above. I scrambled to the switchboard mounted on the wall and threw the heavy copper knife switch. The effect was instantaneous and blinding. A string of industrial bulbs hanging from the ceiling rafters flickered and then blazed into life, flooding the Quonset with a harsh, brilliant yellow light. The shadows that had been crowding us for days were banished instantly. But more than the light, it was the electric heater I had found in the back of the shop, a coil of resistance wire in a ceramic frame, that changed everything. I plugged it in, and the coils turned orange. The hum of the generator was loud, but to us, it sounded like a choir. We weren't just surviving the storm anymore, we were pushing it back. In the brilliant illumination of the workspace, I saw things I had missed in the lantern's gloom. Behind the workbench, the light revealed a seam in the metal wall, a panel that didn't quite match the rivet pattern of the others. I took a pry bar and wedged it into the gap. It popped open with a groan of rusted hinges, revealing a shallow wall safe. It wasn't locked. Inside, there was no money, no gold, just a thick, leather-bound logbook and a rolled-up tube of blueprints dated 1919. I opened the logbook on the workbench, the electric light spilling over the pages. The handwriting was precise engineering script. It detailed soil samples, bedrock depths, and something else, a recurring mention of Aquifer Access Point 4. I didn't know what it meant yet, but as the wind battered the steel walls outside, I knew that the man who built this place hadn't just been a mechanic. He had been a guardian. The storm broke 2 days later, leaving the world buried under 3 feet of drifting snow. We had to dig a tunnel just to get out the front door, channeling through the white wall until we broke into the blinding sunshine. The silence of the flats was absolute, broken only by the steady, comforting chug of our generator downstairs. We were safe, warm, and surprisingly well-fed on beans and cornbread cooked atop the stove. But the peace was fragile. Late in the afternoon, the silence was shattered by the roar of an engine. Not a smooth sedan this time, but the heavy, grinding gears of a truck. I wiped my hands on a rag and stepped out, squinting against the glare. A flatbed truck with county surveyor, stenciled on the door, was idling at the edge of our clearing. 2 men in heavy coats were already unloading transit poles and measuring chains. They weren't asking permission. They were driving stakes into the snow, marching toward the hut with the entitlement of men who believe they own the map. I walked out to meet them, Rose staying in the doorway with a hammer she refused to put down. The lead man was thick-necked, with a face red from the wind and a clipboard held like a weapon. "You need to clear out, lady," he said without looking up, checking a number on a brass tag he was tying to a stake. "This structure has been deemed structurally unsound. Condemnation order came down this morning. We're tagging it for demolition." He thrust a pink slip of paper toward me. It was official, stamped with the county seal, citing rust fatigue and improper foundation. It was a lie, and a lazy one. I didn't take the paper. Instead, I pointed to the roof of the hut, where the snow had melted evenly, proof of the heat retention, and then to the generator exhaust puffing clean gray smoke. Unsound? I asked, my voice carrying over the idling truck. This building has withstood a blizzard that tore the roof off the town hall, if the radio reports are right. It has running electricity, heat, and a foundation poured 3 feet deep into the bedrock. I have the blueprints. The surveyor stopped, his eyes narrowing. He hadn't expected blueprints. He hadn't expected a woman who knew what a foundation looked like. Paperwork says it's a scrap shed, he sneered, stepping closer, using his size to intimidate. Paperwork says you're trespassing on a hazard zone. Now, we can do this the easy way, or the sheriff can come remove you for child endangerment. That was the trigger. The threat to Rose. My fear evaporated, replaced by a cold, metallic anger that felt like the steel I had been working with all week. I pulled the heavy iron wrench I had tucked into my belt, a 24-inch pipe wrench that weighed 5 pounds. I didn't raise it. I just let it hang by my side, a heavy pendulum. This is private property, I said, my voice dropping an octave, deadly calm. And under the Homestead Act provisions of the deed I signed, you are required to provide 48 hours notice before a survey. You have 0. Get off my land. The man hesitated. He looked at the wrench, then at the humming hut, then back at his partner who was watching nervously. They were hired bullies, not soldiers. The math of the situation, the isolation, the heavy tool in my hand, the sheer unexpected competence of the resistance, shifted in his eyes. He spat on the snow. Fine. But the sheriff is coming, Mrs. Vance. And he brings a gun, not a wrench. They packed up their gear and reversed the truck, churning the snow into brown slush. The next morning, I knew I couldn't just wait for the next attack. I had to go on the offensive. I dressed in my husband's old work trousers, cinched with a belt and a heavy wool coat, tucking the leather logbook and the blueprints into a satchel. I left Rose with Mr. Gantry, who had miraculously battered his way down the track in his delivery truck to check on us. He was a gruff man, but when he saw the generator running and the warmth of the hut, he had looked at me with a new kind of respect. I'll watch the girl, he had grunted, sitting by the stove with a shotgun across his knees. Nobody gets past the door. I took his truck into town, the gears grinding as I navigated the slushy roads to the county clerk's office. The town was still digging out, piles of dirty snow banking the sidewalks. I didn't look like the widow who had left weeks ago. I had grease under my fingernails that no amount of scrubbing could remove, and I walked with the heavy, purposeful stride of someone who has kept a fire burning through a storm. The clerk's office was busy, filled with people complaining about snow removal. I bypassed the line and went straight to the Hall of Records. I needed to understand what Aquifer Access Point 4 meant. I spent 3 hours poring over geological maps and old railway contracts, cross-referencing them with the logbook from the safe. The picture that emerged was breathtaking in its scope. The cancelled railway project hadn't been cancelled because of money. It was cancelled because the water table was too high. The entire valley was sitting on a massive, pressurized aquifer, and my Quonset hut sat directly on top of the only stable bedrock cap capable of supporting a heavy-duty pumping station. Sterling and his investors didn't want the land for a subdivision. They were a front for the Regional Water Commission. They wanted to drill through my floor and siphon the water to sell to the thirsty industrial districts 3 counties over. They were going to make millions, and they had offered me $50. I felt a tap on my shoulder. It was the clerk who had sold me the deed, the thin man with the ink-stained cuffs. He looked nervous, glancing at the door. "Mrs. Vance," he whispered, "you shouldn't be here. Sterling is in with the mayor right now. They're drawing up an eminent domain seizure order. They're going to claim the land is essential for public utility." I looked at him, clutching my satchel. "Let them try," I said. "Is there a lawyer in this town who isn't in their pocket?" The clerk hesitated, then scribbled a name on a scrap of paper. "Judge Halloway. He's retired. Hates Sterling. Lives on the North Ridge. But Clara." Be careful. These men, they think money is the only law. I took the paper. Money is just paper, I said, thinking of the $5 bill that had started this. Iron is the law, and I'm sitting on the iron. Judge Holloway lived in a house that smelled of old tobacco and leather bindings. He was a man carved from oak, 80 years old if he was a day, with eyebrows like overgrown hedgerows. He listened to me without interrupting, his eyes closed, his fingers tapping on the arm of his chair. When I finished explaining the aquifer, the blueprints, and the threats, he opened his eyes. They were sharp, blue, and amused. So, he rumbled, you bought a lemon and found out it was a gold mine, and now the sharks smell blood. He took the deed from me and studied it under a magnifying glass. The as-is clause, he muttered. Beautiful. Cuts both ways. Usually, it protects the seller from liability. But here, look at this addendum. He pointed to a faint line of text I had missed. Includes all subsurface mineral and resource rights not previously claimed by the Crown, since the railway project was private, and they folded before claiming the water. The rights had transferred with the land. You own the water, Mrs. Vance? Holloway said, a grin breaking through his beard. Or at least you own the cork in the bottle. They can't drill without your permission, and they can't seize it under eminent domain if you can prove you are already utilizing the resource for personal and commercial sustenance. That's the loophole. He looked at me. Are you utilizing it? I thought of the generator, the tools, the plans I was drawing up. I'm about to, I said. I'm opening a repair shop, and I'll need a lot of water for cooling and cleaning. Holloway laughed, a dry, barking sound. Good. We draft the incorporation papers tonight. Vance Mechanics and Utility. By tomorrow morning, you won't be a squatter. You'll be a rival corporation. The confrontation happened at noon the next day. I was back at the hut, Rose helping me bolt a new sign to the front of the Quonset. Mr. Gantry had parked his truck sideways across the track, blocking the path. When Sterling's black sedan arrived, trailed by the sheriff's cruiser and a flatbed carrying a bulldozer, they found their path blocked. Sterling got out, his face twisted in annoyance. The sheriff, a man I knew by reputation as a bully, stepped out with his hand on his holster. Move the truck, Gantry, the sheriff yelled. We have a court order. I stepped out from behind the truck, holding not a wrench this time, but a sheaf of papers stamped by Judge Holloway. I walked right up to the sheriff, ignoring Sterling. Sheriff, I said, my voice projecting clearly in the cold air. If you cross that line, you are trespassing on the corporate property of Vance Mechanics, a registered utility provider. And if that bulldozer touches my structure, you will be liable for damages to critical infrastructure. Sterling laughed, a harsh, incredulous sound. Corporate property? It's a junk shed with a woman in it. Sheriff, tear it down. The sheriff hesitated. He knew Holloway's signature when he saw it. I turned to Sterling. It's not a shed, I said, locking eyes with him. It's the capstone to the aquifer you're trying to steal. I know about the water, Sterling. I have the surveys. And I have the deed that gives me the rights. Sterling's face went pale, the arrogance draining out of him like dirty water. You can't. You don't have the capital to develop that water, he hissed, lowering his voice so the townspeople gathering on the road couldn't hear. You're holding a winning lottery ticket you can't cash. Sell to me. $5,000. Walk away rich. $5,000. It was a fortune. It was a life of ease for Rose. I looked at my daughter, who was watching me from the doorway, her chin held high. Then I looked at the hut, the rust I had scrubbed, the warmth we had made, the home that had saved us when the world threw us away. I don't want to be rich, Mr. Sterling, I said quietly. I want to be secure, and I want to work. I turned back to the sheriff. The price for the water is a leasing contract. 10% of gross revenue, to be paid to a community trust, and a permanent ban on any drilling within 50 yards of my home. Take it or leave it. If you leave it, I'll pour concrete down the access shaft tonight and seal it forever. Sterling looked at me, looked at the resolute set of my jaw, and realized he had lost. He wasn't fighting a widow anymore. He was fighting the bedrock. Spring came slowly to Dead Man's Flats, the snow retreating to reveal patches of hardy green scrub. The Quonset hut looked different now. The rust had been treated and painted a deep industrial blue. A proper sign hung above the door, Vance Repair and Supply. The sound of the generator was gone, replaced by the hum of mains power, part of the deal I had negotiated. The water pumping station had been built 100 yards down the road, a neat brick building that provided a steady royalty check, enough to keep the pantry full and Rose in new clothes. But we didn't move to a mansion. We stayed in the hut. I stood by the open bay doors, wiping grease from a carburetor I had just rebuilt for Mr. Gantry's fleet. Rose was at the workbench, carefully filing a gear for a clock she was trying to fix, inheriting her grandfather's hands. A car slowed down on the main road, a luxury vehicle, unmistakably belonging to my mother-in-law. Paused for a long moment. I didn't wave. I just stood there, holding my wrench, surrounded by the smell of oil and coffee and success. The car lingered, the passenger watching the woman and child who were supposed to have disappeared into the cold, then accelerated away, disappearing toward the city. I turned back to the shop, to the work, to the life we had hammered out of the iron. Rose, I called out. Soup's on. Wash up. She looked up, her face smudged with oil, grinning a grin that was all victory. Coming, Mama, she said. We were home.